Hey everyone, Cody here, and sorry that this is a weird angle, but my webcam is just not working correctly, so this is how we're going to have to do it. Anyway, today in this video, I want to give you at least 5 tips for using NovelCrafter. So today I just finished writing a 350,000 word book. Yes, I did use AI, but I wrote over 90% of it myself. So a lot of it, actually, let's say 80 to 90, to be honest. I would write most of the scene and then just have NovelCrafter kind of fill in the gaps of a lot of the details. So today I want to talk about my experience with NovelCrafter and just some tips to help you, if you're using it, to kind of get more out of it, because NovelCrafter is great. I have no complaints on NovelCrafter. It is actually, I feel like for the price, it's actually very good. And yes, you do have to kind of pay for AI credits, like if you use OpenRouter or OpenAI or something. But as far as, using those services, like you really can kind of choose how much you use out of that. So let's go ahead and jump over to NovelCrafter and I will talk about those things kind of in turn. Okay, so the first thing that I would recommend for using NovelCrafter is to write the specifics of your book. First off, I would just write as much as you can for a scene yourself, but focus on the specifics. And what I mean by that is, sometimes what's really important to you is dialogue, or sometimes there's a specific event in a scene that matters to you as the writer. Be sure to include those things in your scene. Now, it sounds kind of intuitive, right? Like, oh yeah, obviously I'm going to include that. But even if you're having AI write a large portion of the book, you still want to make sure you include the specific things that are going to make your book your book. And so for me, dialogue is very important. I think that dialogue, good or bad dialogue, can actually make or break a story. And I actually really like dialogue because dialogue it's kind of grounding, right? It helps you to kind of ground the story. Dialogue tells a lot about the story, what's going on. It tells a lot of, maybe a character's backstory. It tells just a lot of things you can kind of put into dialogue. And it's way more interesting than just reading, show instead of tell. So just reading a bunch of information is not nearly as exciting as kind of watching characters work through conflict through dialogue. And I believe that all stories are just basically a series of conflicts. But more on that later. So the first tip that I have for you is just to make sure that you include the important parts when you're writing a scene. It's a lot easier to write it all into the pre-draft using the AI than it is to add it later. Now, you can do that. But for me, like I said, dialogue is a huge thing. And so when I wrote, a lot of my scenes, I had to make sure that I included dialogue that I wanted. The biggest thing and the biggest reason why is because a lot of the dialogue that AI writes is not very good. It's very cheesy, very generic. Sometimes it's really good, but a lot of times it's actually it's kind of hallucinatory, right? It actually just talks about things that don't even happen in the story. Even if you're using NovelCrafter, which can see the outline or the summaries of the previous chapters, it will still talk about nonsense. So for me, I would just say to include as much of that stuff in there as possible, at least somewhat. Now, there is kind of a trick, and if you don't know what to put in a scene for the characters to say, you can actually write in here, and just so you know what you're saying a scene from the book that I just finished. I don't want to show you too much because I do want to finish, I want to go back and edit and, put it out for people to read. But essentially, if you don't know what to put as far as dialogue for a scene, then you can always just say, the character said something uplifting to XYZ character, or the character gave him a secret or gave him a command or something like that. You could generalize in the dialogue what you want characters to say. I actually just did this. My cats are going crazy. I just did this in a scene where I actually wrote so-and-so told so-and-so sorry, or, he said something, but it didn't say like that character said this. I just said he, shared his regret or something like that. So you can put kind of a generic thing in there for the AI to kind of fill in the gaps, and it does help to give it direction. I really think that giving it as much direction or kind of bare bones outline as possible going into a scene will definitely help it kind of stay on track. Now, the next suggestion I have for you is that you basically get what you pay for. And what I mean by that is that using more premium models will give you more premium results. So Claude 3.7 Sonnet has come out since the other videos I did on NovelCrafter, and it is phenomenal. Like I have not enough good things to say about the prose that 3.7 writes. Now, it's not perfect by any means. AI is getting, it's kind of getting a lot, better over the last even year. And it is really good. Now, again, you still have to give it an immense amount of direction, but using 3.7 for me has been game changing. Now, it's not cheap, okay? So using these models, especially 3.7, it adds up quick. I mean, you can get a few thousand words and it's like 20 cents. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up real quick. And if you're writing, 100,000 words, I think that it comes out to $20 or something, which again, is relatively cheap if you were going to pay for someone to make this book. But just know that I have tried a lot of the models, and hands down, 3.7 Sonnet is probably the best one out currently. Now, other people might have other experiences, but I have tried a lot of them, spent hundreds of dollars on OpenRouter just to find out that 3.7 is the GOAT. And that's not just for the writing, that is for the chat and for the summaries as well. So just keep that in mind. Now, you can kind of circumvent a little bit of that by giving it a lot of outline and then just having the AI kind of fill it in. You can kind of get like Wizard LLM or OpenAI's like, O4 Mini or whatever. You can kind of get some of these other models to give you decent results. And I know there are some like higher end free ones right now. Like there's DeepSeek R1, I think a free version. And then there's the new Google Gemini 2 or whatever. There's a free version of that too. They're okay. Okay. I found that they're okay. They give you kind of generic results, but Claude is just, I don't know, man, it's something else and I enjoy it. So just keep that in mind that, the model you use really affects the output that you get. 3 is you want to use, or at least I use prose modifiers. And so what I mean by this is I'm going to show you on my screen, but a prose modifier is something that I add to the scene beat before I have it generate any text that kind of helps steer it into the direction I want it to go, or it kind of modifies the writing style outside of that. So let's switch over to the computer and I want to talk about that. So here, we have some ways we can kind of manipulate the prose or the output of the AI, right? We can go into our codex and clear that, and we can kind of go down and we can add some prose style guides here. And I actually have 2, but anyway, you can add kind of a style here. And you can also go into the prompts and you can kind of edit the prompts here, and you can change the instructions, which I've done a little bit. In fact, you can kind of take a look. Since my book is a dark action fantasy story, and dark I mean as in kind of grim, I actually put that into the instructions. So you can kind of come in here and change some of this. That's really the only thing I did. I did this right here, your prose. However, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I haven't noticed that much of a difference changing some of this stuff. A little bit of a difference, but it still kind of tends to write things its own way. Like it still kind of tends to lean towards its default functions. So what I found when I was using these prose style guides and, the instructions in the actual prompts, that it did help, but it still did not give me some usable stuff that I was okay with using. And so what I did was I came up with my own prose modifier. I talked about this in a previous video, but I'm going to show you now. So I wrote out some prose, like a prose modifier. And what I do is I copy this and I go into the section I'm writing and I paste this in to the scene beat before it writes the scene. Okay, so I don't want you to read that one. I know I'm hoping people will respect that, but it is what it is. So let's just come here. Okay, so in this section, I don't have it here because I don't know if I had come up with it back then, like earlier in the book. I was working on this book for 8 months. But anyway, I came up with a prose modifier and I would put it in here. So it says, describe the scene in extreme detail, because I'm trying to extend how much I get out of the AI. Yes, it will use more credits, but I don't want to have to keep going back and like adding more. I would rather do a lot up front and then kind of distill it, because if I get more out of the AI, I can take out the stuff I don't like, but it's harder to add stuff in later, right? It's possible, of course, but if I can get it to put in a lot of stuff, if there's stuff that I do like from it, I can actually just keep that stuff and then trim everything else. And if you kind of go the Stephen King route of trimming like roughly 10%, well, this is a book of 350,000 words. That's going to trim out about 30K, 35K. So if I trim out that much and it goes down closer to 300, then that's going to help me because it's going to give me that extra buffer. Now, I'm not putting in a ton of words just to take them out, but my point is that it's easier to remove than it is to add. So basically this scene modifier says, describe the scene in extreme detail, filling in any gaps in the scene and adding detail when possible to improve the scene. Add sensory and environmental details when possible, but describe things in a new, surreal, or abstract way, avoiding cliches, and do not default to your default way of describing things. Do not use the words tapestry, divine, or testament, because, oh my God, these AI love these 3 words. I have no idea why. Tapestry is like the biggest sin I've ever seen, where it just uses it in every form and fashion. Anyway, also, you can add dialogue and actions in between dialogue or character reactions, but make any additional dialogue sound natural, realistic, and grounded. Now, I can copy and paste this into the description area of YouTube if you want, just so you can kind of see it. But essentially, this has really helped me immensely. So while having a style prose guide and having it in the instructions has helped a little bit, this has helped me an immense amount. So sometimes it would only give me maybe 1,000 words when it generated. If I put this into the same scene, sometimes it'll push it past 1,200, 1,300, 1,400. And again, yes, it's going to use me more credits, but it's really not, it's a few cents, right? But if I have gotten some really good nuggets of dialogue or description that I'm like, oh, I really like that description. I never would have thought of that. So having something like this, a prose modifier or a scene modifier, whatever you want to call it, has actually helped me a lot. So I would challenge you to kind of maybe think about adding something like this to your scenes. You don't have to copy mine. You can, but having something that will help you kind of distill it a little bit more, because again, the AI just always defaults to its natural, state. It wants to give you its default answer. So what we want to do is kind of stretch the AI and get more out of it. So that's kind of what this is for. All right, the next, trick or tip I can give you for NovelCrafter is to use nicknames. So when I was writing this book, it has a lot of characters, right? But a lot of the characters, because it's kind of a fantasy book, there are some names in here that are really long. And so what I did is I got tired of writing those names over and over and over. And some of the characters have multiple different forms, or they have different versions of themselves. And so, like, for instance, I have this guy, Azazel, Incarnation of Wrath, and then Azazel, Principality of Wrath. Well, in a codex entry, you can give them a nickname, right? Well, if I just have Azazel, right, I have 2 Azazels, so I can't just reference him as Azazel in NovelCrafter, because then it won't know which one to pick, right? However, if I have Principality of Wrath, then I can use the nickname and it knows which one it is because I added it as a nickname here. And then this other guy can do Incarnation of Wrath. But it gets even easier because I don't want to type Incarnation of Wrath every single time. I don't want to write Principality of Wrath every single time. So what I suggest is doing this. You can come up with a nickname where it's just 3 letters, like the first few letters or the first letter of each name. And this is a shortcut that I recommend doing because it has helped me save a lot of time. So even writing the last part of the book, I referenced the same few characters over and over and over and over and over. But there was like different versions of some of those characters because they go through like a transformation at the end of the book. And so, to give them separate codex entries because maybe they look different or they have different, abilities, I didn't want to type out these really long names over and over again. So what I did is I came up with a nickname that was a short, it was just the letters of their name, right? The abbreviations. And then just type that in there. Because if you have a nickname and then you reference it in in a codex entry or in a scene, it'll pull the information from that same codex entry. So I don't have to type Azazel, incarnation of wrath. I can just type IOW, 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 and it will pull the information from this codex entry. So I recommend coming up with nicknames for your characters. And if you get tired of writing them out over and over and over, or you have multiple codex entries for, maybe the same person, but they're slightly different because they have different meanings, come up with nicknames, especially short ones, that you can just reference in the book as you're writing. Because when you write your scene, you can just put the nickname and it'll pull that information. Then later, when you go to edit the book, because I really hope you're editing it, you can go back and then you can just kind of do replace all if you're in a Word document and just replace all with that nickname. So this has helped me a lot. I actually came up with it towards the end of doing this story. So I wish I had thought of it earlier, but it has helped me a lot because I have, they have like longer names. So I just put LFH, 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 and then I can go back and I can just replace all those LFHs with the actual name or with, the first name, whatever. So that's another suggestion I have on nicknames. So the last suggestion I have for you is about codex entries, and then I'm going to recap a couple things I talked about in my other videos just to kind of hammer these home. I recommend multiple codex entries for a couple of things. First off, if you have a character that has different versions of themselves, do a couple of different codex entries and just give them different names. When you go and edit later, you can always change the name in the actual book, but you could just reference them as one thing to get through the book. And then later you could always change the name to be the same as the other one if it's the same person, right? Kind of this whole Azazel thing that you see here. The other thing that I do is I have a codex entry for everything. You can see I have like 295 codex entries. That's a lot. That's a decent amount. And so with that, I wrote one for every single creature, for every single person, for every single item, for every single area, then for every single building that was going to be referenced within that area. And then even in the building, I would reference specific rooms if they mattered, right? If it mattered, if the room had some kind of significance, I gave that room a name. And then in that room, I had a codex entry. So even rooms within buildings had their own codex entry. This way, I don't have to remember everything that's in the room. I can just put it all into one codex entry and it's all here. So like, for instance, you can see, I have just realized how small my screen might be. I apologize. But anyway, so you might be able to see this. It says the Crucible, then the Crucible entry hall, then the Crucible execution site, then the Crucible holding cells, Crucible interrogation room, and then Crucible torture chamber. So this is one big prison area, right? So I came up with a different codex entry for every single area that they went to. That way I didn't have to describe it over and over and over, or I didn't have to remember it myself. I can just basically write it out, write all of the stuff that's in there, and then create a codex entry. And then when I'm writing this scene, I just say, yes, they are doing this in this room, right? Just name the codex entry. It'll pull the information. And then I have that, prose modifier on there that tells it to pull that information. Oh, another prose modifier that I use that I didn't mention is I will literally just tell, I would tell ChatGPT, I will tell NovelCrafter to describe something. So let's say that my characters came into this area. Okay, Shadowmere, right? You can see it on the screen right here. It says Shadowmere. Maybe I wanted to tell it something specific, or I wanted to describe it. So I would put Shadowmere, And then I would put usually just like in parentheses, describe ℙ𝕃𝔼𝔸𝕊𝔼. And then I would put it in parentheses like that, and then the AI would actually describe what it looks like. So anytime I'm coming to something new or introducing something new, like if they see a building in the distance, I will say, please describe XYZ place or whatever. And then I wouldn't necessarily name it in the final book, but I would put that little snippet in there so that it puts some descriptive text of that thing. So essentially I have a codex entry for everything, even things within things. So I recommend coming up with codex entries you don't have to do this, right? You don't have to do this for every room in a house. But if every room that they were going to was significant, then I create a codex entry so I can just reference the codex entry and it pulls all that information every single time. As opposed to just doing one for like the castle and then having all the rooms in that one codex entry for the castle. You can do that, but once the codex entries get really long, it's harder for it to pull all the information from one codex entry. So I just do separate ones, and then that way when they move into a new room, it only has to reference that one. So that's what I do. So that's pretty much the 5 tips, but I do want to go over a couple of things that I talked about in my last videos to really kind of, recap. Obviously, I already talked about codex entries. Snippets. I use snippets all the time. The biggest 2 things that I use snippets for. 1, I use it as like a notepad. So I basically just use snippets because it's not seen by the AI. I use snippets to kind of remind myself of things. So I have 2 main ones that I use. Things to change in the final, which I'm not going to show you. But essentially, as I'm going through the book and I realize that I wrote something wrong, or, I might have something that's conflicting, the biggest thing that kills people is that they stop and they try to go back and fix it, and then they stop and go back and fix it. No, what I have realized is more important to have a finished project than it is to stop and try to make it perfect. So what I do is now I'll just put a note. Oh, I need to fix this scene, or might be a conflict between this and this, and so on and so forth. And I just keep writing the book, and then I have a whole notepad basically right here of all of the things I need to go back and fix in the story, with references either to the scene or the section of the story, or just a recurring theme that I need to take a look at when I'm reading the book back to myself. So I use it as kind of a notepad as I'm going along, so it's all in one place. The other thing that I use it for is that prose writing. Basically, I've kind of distilled it over time. I've like worked on it over and over and over again. I'm pretty satisfied with this one. It works out pretty well, especially with Sonnet 3.7. I cannot express how well that one works, especially when you have it kind of tuned. Also, I will share this on... If you use Claude 3.5 or Sonnet, which you may as well use 7 if you were using 5 because it's the same price, but even better. I actually do have 0.8 on temperature and 0.5 for frequency of penalty. That may be similar to Nerdy Novelist. I don't remember. I really don't remember his name because he's the one I even heard about NovelCrafter. So I watch his videos intermittently. But anyway, I do have a little bit of temperature on there, so just as a heads up. But going back to the snippets, snippets are very useful, and I do use them. Lastly is the chats. So I use the chat if I'm stuck. So the problem I have, and I've talked about this in my other videos, is ChatGPT only remembers so much. So even though I started a thread talking about, different characters and places in my book with ChatGPT to get description ideas, a few queries later, it would not even remember that we had talked about it, or it would get information wrong. So like I would have this character with kind of this distinct trait, and then it would actually give me a different trait instead. And I'm like, no, that's not what we talked about. Oh, you're right. And then it would fix it. But I had to keep doing that over and over and over. So that's why I love having codex entries, because I can actually just get it to a point where I like it, have it give me a suggestion. If I like it, then I can just put it in, or I can just change it in the codex entry itself, and it's done. It's just going to reference it from that point on in the book. So I use the chat because the chat can actually reference the outline or the scene you're working on. And so if I'm stuck and I say, I need the characters to get from XYZ to ABC, and here's where they're at. I can just tell it that, and it knows based on what's happened so far, either just on the scene or the outline, that, hey, okay, the characters have access to these resources. Maybe they can do this, this, or this. And I'll just tell it, I'll talk to it naturally. But that's pretty much it. Those are all the suggestions I have after writing this book. It has been a really long process, and I do want to share kind of a video later on about just some of the things that going through that process has really helped me with. But I hope that you got something out of this NovelCrafter video, that these tips and tricks will actually serve you well and, help you with NovelCrafter. If you have any questions about NovelCrafter or writing with NovelCrafter, ask me. You can put them in the description and I will try my best to answer them. And if it's kind of a long, more complex thing, I will try to do a video on it if I'm able to. But that's it. I appreciate you guys watching. Take care. God bless, and see you.